Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Mind. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Tech Strong Learning, where we have an exciting presentation ahead. Before we get this conversation rolling, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review. First of all, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, or if you'd like to rewatch or share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You'll get that shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you'd like to engage with our panel, there are a couple of ways you can do so. The first and the easiest option is to use that chat tab on the right side of your screen. So if you see that chat tab, I'd like you to go ahead and let us know from where in the world you are joining us today. If you have any specific questions for our panel, we do want you to send those into the Q&A tab. Sending your questions to the Q&A just helps us keep track, and we want to address as many of your questions as we can today. So please do send them in there as soon as you have them. Additionally, before we close things out today, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around to see if you're one of our lucky winners. And my final note is on the handout section of the webinar screen on the right, you will see a couple of additional resources there for you. So feel free to grab those. Our topic today is holistic AppSec and software supply chain security. And I'm joined today by Sam Quackenbush, Senior Director of Field Innovation and Strategy at Mind.io. We're also joined by Chris Taylor, Head of Cyber Defense at MSCI. And of course, we have today on the panel our very own Mitchell Ashley, CTO of TechStrong Group. So Mitchell, Sam, and Chris, thank you all so much for joining us today. Mitch, do you want to get this conversation rolling?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and great privilege being with Sam Quakenbush and Chris Taylor here on our conversation. So broad topic, like how do you talk about holistic application security and some software supply chain in 50 minutes, go. There's a lot of things to discuss. And so we're going to take an experiential path talking about, well, here's kind of things we've done. Here's what we've seen, some of the challenges, what we've learned, that kind of thing. There aren't slides. There isn't, we're going to tell you the 5 things you have to do. We may share that as our experience, but it'll be very interactive. So I really encourage everyone to react and join us in the chat. So, put your thoughts, your questions, your ideas, your reactions. Hey, I really agree with that. Or, that's not what we do here. I think I think it's different. Or, hey, I don't know what to do about this. Like we're being asked, how do we go beyond this to that? So engage with us, and we'll engage with you in the chat as well as incorporate that into the conversation. So you really can help shape and guide where the next 50 minutes go with us. So please do that. The more you do that, the more fun it is for all of us. And I think everybody gets a lot more out of it. So let's get to our topic. We're talking about, application security and software supply chain. Both are kind of hot topics on the tip of the tongues of certainly software engineering, security, CISOs, CIOs. It's in the lexicon of what they're talking about. And so we can cover a number of areas. But I think, Sam, you had some ideas about how to start off our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mitch. So, Chris has been a practitioner in application security for quite some time. And he has very robust programs at the places he's worked. But, when we were talking about this, we were thinking, what if you had to start all over again? What if you, let's just say you went somewhere brand new, or what advice would you give to people that are just starting off on their application security journey? They have to build out a program from scratch. Now that you've got all this experience, what are the top 3 things or tools you'd implement? What would be your advice to the new beginner?
So, yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Sam. The challenge, I think, in the application security space is that we are sort of shifting left, getting involved into areas where we traditionally have not in a lot of cases, right? And developers are very sensitive to additional work. And so one of the key things as you approach this, first of all, is to approach it with empathy, right? You have to think through how are you going to integrate with development teams? What are their needs? What are their concerns? And you have to basically frame the entire strategy around that. Okay. And as you're looking at that, you really want to go after solutions that have scalable outcomes. Okay. If you start going into something that creates a huge mess for developers, it's going to be very, very difficult to develop and maintain momentum. So for that reason, doing things like software composition analysis that you can then automate with various sorts of open source tools, including RenovateBot, helps you not only provide an analysis of the type of problems you're going to face, but also a scalable solution to address them. So solutions that do SAST end up helping out with integrating into the IDE so that you can help developers learn about what they did wrong at that point in time. So don't develop a program that requires them to submit the application for scanning, get the results back and learn. You want to really get those lessons learned into the development loop as quick as possible. So it's not just about getting SCA or SAST involved in that, but also getting it involved further left in the development cycle and really reducing the friction for the developers. If you don't pay enough attention to that friction, then you're likely to get cut off at the knees as you're trying to develop a new application security program. The last thing I would say is really sort of, some people it sort of shocks them and some people sort of, yeah, I get it, which is inventory. If you don't have a good inventory, everything else is going to be 10 times harder. And so when you're first starting an application security program, a lot of times you don't have a robust inventory and you have to go with what you got, right? That happens. That's life. So you have to balance those sort of short-term needs versus having a systemic inventory in the long term. And really having an inventory is not an application security issue, but it is so very critical. So those are the three things I would sort of start with. I wouldn't do DAST, to be honest with you. I haven't had great success with DAST scanning just because it requires a tremendous amount of skill by the practitioner to resolve the alerts. So I would sort of say SCA because you can have scalable results, a SaaS capability if you could integrate it into the development environment, and then an inventory, which is, impacts everything you do, security or not.
So that brings up, I guess, a clarification. You mentioned RenovateBot, which, just to clarify that for everybody, it's a free tool out there that basically bumps your dependencies. It's the equivalent of like GitHub Dependabot, right? But it works for all different types of source controls. So that's what Chris is talking about. He says automatable answers, right? Automatically upgrading your dependencies. And then, so when you talk about an inventory, like an application inventory, understanding and knowing what you've got.
Yeah.
Is an Excel sheet the way to go? If you had some recommendations on what you would do with an application. So please expand on your meaning.
Yeah, sure. So you can do things where you align, for example, I'm going to take ADO because that's where we are. You could align your ADO projects and then the repos to an alignment conceptually of what are the services I'm selling and what are the microservices that need to align to that. That is a technique. Some organizations don't want to do that because of the complexities it has to do with compilation and packaging and things like that. That can make it more difficult sometimes. So some people don't want to do that, but you really have to have an alignment and a data model for how you align what are we selling and what customers care about, all the way down to what is the repo, right? And it's hard. It's very, very hard to do, actually. So yeah, you're laughing. It is not easy to do.
I'm laughing also at this Excel number one.
Yeah. If you have it in Excel, you're going. I mean, that's not a bad place to start because that's sort of an immediate action type of thing. But that's not going to scale if you've got hundreds of microservices or thousands, right? So we're using something called Spotify's Backstage capability to help drive that through that portal. We haven't had much success in the past with various CMDBs as a capability. And I just haven't seen them myself. They don't seem to really integrate well with development processes. But Spotify is built by developers for developers. They're a little open source project. So that's what we're using and adopting and scaling. There's some growing pains like anything, but we're leveraging that, tagging it into, like with the tag functionality within Mend. We're using that to tag the repo identifiers and linking things up so that we can know at scale if we have, for example, this libwebp that just happened the 0 day, right? We're able to go through and chain and say, hey, where are the repos? Where's the technical services and who owns them, right? That's the key issue. Who owns them? And driving that accountability at scale.
There was a good question in the chat. Someone asked initially is like, what do you mean by inventory? You think of it as, is it down to here's all the open source packages or software elements that I'm using, where they come from?
No.
Is it here's my apps and kind of all the major pieces of it in our code and where they are in the repository?
Sure. Yeah, it's the second for sure, right? And then we're driving sort of inventory from like an SBOM perspective via the APIs that we use from Mend, right? So the detailed inventory of the libraries we get from the Sbomb feature exports from Mend. But in terms of the overall, you need to align responsibility for those repos and the outcomes of that, so you know who needs to action what, right? Without that, it's very hard to do. So you're going to have some degree of an inventory of who owns what capability that you're selling or that you have internally, and then all the way traceability all the way down to here's the repo, right? And so we're going through that journey now. I think we're pretty far along. Like anything else, there's always incremental improvements, but it's an exciting place to be because we can know very, very quickly who's responsible for this repo. For looking for libwebp or any other 0-day, going back to Spring for Shell, right? Like having all that kind of traceability all the way down. So,
you talk about responsibility. I haven't experienced this with, in terms of smaller software teams, but with larger ones, it's like sometimes it surfaces as we don't know who's responsible. Nobody has claimed responsibility. That person left and it just kind of languished.
Yep. So the way we look at that is sort of like it's sort of an organizational level responsibility, right? That's why I sort of jokingly say distribution lists cannot be the owner. Because if everybody owns it, nobody owns it, right? It's that guy. That doesn't work. That just doesn't work. So
everybody owns security, by the way, which means nobody owns it.
Which means nobody owns it, right? Yeah. So those are some of the challenges, right? And I think when you align the responsibility to an individual in terms of a role, as opposed to an individual by name, then the question is what happens to that role over time, right? So the head of blah, 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 right? And then that becomes an organizational design and change management issue. But yeah. At the end of the day, it's sort of like, okay, here's the ADO project or the housing of all the repos. Who's responsible for that? They're responsible for ensuring that the repos have owners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Otherwise, it becomes very difficult. Like you said, people leave, people move on, but you have to have the accountability. And you need to, and the important thing is you have to provide them with tools to effectively manage that. You can't just say it's your problem, good luck. That's not appropriate either. So part of that is you have to be willing to bend over backwards for the stakeholders. You have to
jump in there, Sam. Sam's got a question.
I was just say, kind of looping this back to like what the original topic was, starting things off from like a new perspective. And this also goes into participant 429's question. A lot of things that I see when people are starting to roll out an AppSec program, right? It may be compliance driven. And like your point of having an application inventory, like knowing what you got, step one, right? Using some type of automation to scan everything or figure out what all you have in the first place and get an application inventory. And then, hey, are we producing Sbombs? So the question was, has, Sbomb, has this taken off beyond hand waving?
Yeah.
I'd say
customers asking about it.
Yeah, it depends on where you're at, right? Like I see customers all the time that have to do it because they're being required, like, Chris is saying, and others who are at the beginning of the journey, like, hey, we've not even heard of it. And is this something we need to worry about? It's like, yeah, well, I think you'd hear about it if you need to worry about it.
Yeah, we have customers asking about that already. And so the challenge, I think, is to understand at a very high level, and this is very high level, who's driving this? Okay. The whole SBOM capability has to do with a market inefficiency that the governments are trying to correct. Okay. And specifically, the market inefficiency is where in the past, sometimes software vendors or service providers have sort of inadvertently transferred the risk of ineffective maintenance over to their customers. And the customers are not sufficiently aware of that risk. Okay. And the Sbomb and other emerging standards are an attempt to drive some of that awareness and to fix that inefficiency in the market. So what's happening is that as sort of third-party risk teams ask for these things, you can then take the Sbomb and see, well, are these applications, well maintained, right? And that's a good indicator of risk. So I think over time, more sophisticated consumers at the corporate level are going to be asking for Sbombs. And I think that's the intent of what the of all the public policy arm is to correct the market inefficiency here.
And I can even say here at Mend, when basically when customers are asking, like our requests for proposals, RFIs, you're starting to see like actual SBOMs being requested for, hey, what's the product we're about to buy from you? You know, like procurement, things like that. So we're required to produce SBOMs for our products.
I almost feel like we're in the sort of doing it for compliance reasons. People are asking us for them. And sort of the next phase is like, okay, well, what do you do with your SBOMs, right? How are they created? Or how are they kept up to date? What do you use them for? Do you have a process? Is it actually a source of finding the software that might have vulnerabilities in it once you get something detected? I don't know what that process looks like yet, but it seems like that's sort of one of our next steps to enter that phase of, okay, you got it, but what do you do with it?
So there's two things, right? One of them is how well maintained is it, which is a leading indicator of vulnerabilities, right? So if you go back to Log4j, right, or Spring4Shell or any of these, what you find is teams that struggle to maintain it usually are also the teams that are struggling with maintenance. Teams that struggle to patch are also the ones that are struggling with maintenance. And so if you look at that as a leading indicator and try to solve that leading problem, that's how you can drive awareness. And so if you consume the SBOM, this is 5 major versions behind, right? Then you probably have some software that's not as well maintained as you might like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how much you're keeping up with your backlog of keeping things updated and addressing vulnerabilities.
Which is where RenovateBot, DependABot come into place. So that's the scalable solution that's worked out pretty well for us.
So just to jump in on some chat questions, someone was asking, what is an SBOM and what is a CMDB? SBOM is a software bill of materials, right? It was started to be put in place, right? The Biden administration said after basically a supply chain attack, and you look, there's NTIA standards now on what an SBOM should have in it, quite a few different formats. And then a CMDB, I actually had to Google that one.
Configuration Management Database. Sorry.
Yes.
It's basically, they came out from knowing what hardware you have in the data center and who's been assigned what laptops. They're very ITIL focused. And most of the organizations that have built very large, robust software suites are on ITIL haven't really adopted to more of an agile shift left way of looking at the world, sort of more of a software first sort of mentality. So maybe they'll adjust. I don't know, but it's an alluring answer because, hey, it's right there and it's really easy to use. But when you get into it enough steps down the road, we've always had problems with them.
Yeah. And then participant 429 talked about how SBOMs need to be automated. 100% agree. Basically everything Chris and I talk about so far, and you're starting out with or anything with application security, it all needs to be automated. You can't scale when it's manual. Even the application inventory, Chris was talking about how he uses Backstage to automate getting his application inventory, which is sweet. It's way better than, hey, let's fill out this Excel sheet and try and figure out what repos map to what applications we're selling.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah, that's almost a non-starter from the get-go.
It's an important part. Yeah, any part of we're automating so much more through DevOps and tools and processes and things like that. And it's like security. It can't be a one-time thing, whether it's an SBOM at one point or it's a scan of code or architectural review or whatever. It's got to be built into a flow because software is changing very quickly, more quickly in some organizations than others. But you literally could have, created an SBOM in the morning and 5 minutes later, maybe by the time you saved it to disk, it's already out of date because someone checked something in, pushed it into test, and might have even gone to prod,
That's right. You have to automate these things. And that actually gets to something that's not related to this, but really near and dear to my heart, which is workforce. When you're working through these kind of problems, you have to make sure that you have identified the requirements for the people that are setting these pipelines up, make sure they understand enough about the development process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because if you try to get folks who aren't yet ready for that kind of stuff involved, it can be very difficult for them, and it's almost not fair for them.
Okay, compliments to the audience participants, I should say. Great things in the chat. Keep that up, please. We're enjoying your contributions to the conversation. If I can interject this question, Chris, we didn't really go over your background very much.
Yeah.
Maybe you can give us a summary of that because I'm really interested. You know a lot about software. Not all security people do.
Yeah, so I was a software developer.
Kind of forces that, right?
Yeah, it does, and that gets into the empathy issue, right? Which is I think I understand the development cycle pretty well. So I spent some time in the offensive side in the government, writing software, really offensive stuff. Then transition to the defensive side in response to some incidents that I was asked to assist in, and then bounced around between various different levels of governance within as a contractor in support of senior people, and then transitioned to the commercial side. So I've been a developer. Most of my team, all of my team still writes code right here now. I generally hire developers and teach them security. I find that to be easier for AppSec. So yeah, it's very much developer focused, and that's important because developers, at least in a company like mine, where we're a technology company, our value chain is researcher, developer, sales. Right? That is the value chain. That is how we make money. In a lot of other organizations that are not technology companies, the value chain is slightly different. Either way you look at it, security is always going to be at best adjacent to the value chain. In a lot of organizations, 2 levels removed. And what that means is it's incumbent upon us to provide that value to them in ways that make it easy for them to adopt. And for that, you must have professional empathy. You have to understand the troubles they're going through and anticipate them and get solutions ready for that.
So I have a follow-on question from that.
Yeah,
so speaking of developers and coding and education, where do you feel like developer education sits in this kind of, initial application security rollout?
Yeah, it's tough. So you have part of it where, if you can integrate that in, so you have 2 things. One of them is the pipeline and understanding what the intent is, like the why, the what, and the how, and then make sure you're aligned on the why and the what, and then the how. You provide reference implementations and you teach them how to do these things. So you do have to have an education program, but I find it's much better to have it as integrated as possible into their normal workflow, right? So if you're looking for a SaaS capability, make sure you have one that has integrations with IDEs, with build pipelines, and shows teams what they did wrong at that time, not just say, here's a vulnerability, right? And that kind of stuff is very, very important because you can go do an OWASP top 10. You can have a very mature program in terms of taking the lessons learned in the organization and common vulnerabilities and then flushing them back into the training program. And that's helpful. But what's really helpful is helping people understand when you tell them they did something wrong, why they did something wrong and what they need to do better. I think really that kind of value is much, much higher.
So just-in-time training.
Just-in-time training. Yep.
So I'm gonna throw an exciting one. We'll see how you feel about this. So there's just-in-time training. There's also, all of the AI out there, right? I'm gonna call out just ChatGPT. So what if I took results from static analysis that I said, how do I fix this SQL injection? Pretty common one. ChatGPT should be able to get that, right?
Well, that's the hope.
ChatGPT that, and I'll give you an answer.
Yeah, it'll give you an answer you might believe. And that's sort of the challenge, right? Is that a lot of these tools are meant to give you a convincing answer, not necessarily the best answer. And you have to be aware of that. So can it help familiarity and sort of like any search tool, it can help you understand what to look for next? Yes, but there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. And I think part of that is making sure that you understand what the answer is back and how to leverage it. And it's not just put a question in and get the right answer back. It's unfortunately a lot more complicated than that.
I think my belief is we're all going to come to a point of there is large language models that have everything in it, like the ChatGPTs of the world. And there are, the add-ons from, pick who it might be, but, just pick one. GitHub is an add-on to your development environment that's very trained on code, maybe even certain kinds of code, very good at Java or whatever it might be. It's those more domain-specific LLMs, I think, that are really going to add, not just an answer, but a useful answer, especially if it's building off of any of the data that you have, it's being turned back into the model. So it seems like there's a life cycle we'll need to go through here, but that seems to me where we're really going to see big value from LLMs. And
I think we will. It's just you have to be wise enough to evaluate the answer. If you blindly follow the answer, no matter what tool you're going to get, it's going to be a problem. I mean, we've gone through this whole cycle with no code software development going back to the early 2000s, right? And we keep sort of saying, hey, look, this is going to be the future. This is going to be the future. And to some degree, it does help, right? There's no doubt about that. That it lowers the barrier to entry. It can help you get quick answers out easily. It can help you orient yourself to the environment of the problem that you're trying to deal with. All of those are very valuable, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's a good substitute for wisdom.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on. So if you had to, you had some recommendations, like if you're starting out, what are a couple of things that you really wish you would have known when you were starting out early on?
Oh,
Like, that's a mistake I've made 3 times. I wish I didn't have to make
I try not to
again.
make them 3 times in a row, actually, Mitch.
That's bad. That's really bad if you're making them 3
Yeah, if I
times.
make the
I'm
same
just
mistake
using
3 times
myself
in a
as
row,
an
I sort of
example.
question myself really quickly, actually. I think part of the challenge is consensus building. Earlier in my career, I didn't focus as much on consensus building. I joined
And
MSCI
with
3
who?
years ago.
Who
Um,
do you mean consensus building with?
with the lead developers, with the business. So what oftentimes happens is, the business says, I want this, and developers say, this is how much I can fit in. The business says, get it all done, and the developers sort of figure out a way to, get it done. And part of that consensus building is bringing at a senior level, bringing in the business stakeholders and the application folks and say, okay, listen, these are things that have to get done. The maintenance has to get done. You know what I mean? Otherwise, this is what can happen, right? And there's times especially in a smaller or medium-sized company where you have to take on some risk. The world is not risk-free. But the trick is to make sure that the people who are driving those decisions understand the risk they're taking on, right, at any given time. So I would say, for me, one of the lessons is, making sure that you engage with the right level of seniority and the stakeholders as a senior person. The next level thing is understanding risk management. Okay. What I find is on the technology side, we do a very bad job at understanding risk. And the trouble is that a lot of risk folks don't really fully understand the technology. So I think, again, with the emphasis on professional empathy and meeting people more than halfway, I think it really is incumbent upon people in the application security space, the security space in general, to better understand risk models. Right? What is inherent risk? What are controls? How do controls give you residual risk? What are the control options? How does time fit into this? Right? And I think that is an important aspect that I didn't come to until perhaps a little bit later than I should have. So I would say, as a senior person who's responsible for this, make sure you understand risk, and how the business thinks about risk, so that when you engage with them, you can have those sort of more productive conversations. And then the other piece would be, and part of this is just, the nature of how application security is transformed, which is build it in, build it in, build it in, build it in, build it in. You have to be willing to accept some risk in the short term, sometimes, to build in a solution that is more supportable in the long term. And that is very uncomfortable in a regulatory driven environment, right? Because people want an answer right now for, where is this? Why isn't this done? And the reality is, if you go play whack-a-mole, and then you're going to have to hire a whole bunch of people to play whack-a-mole, and that's going to become unsustainable. Whereas if you build a machine to help you whack the moles, right? You know what I mean? It becomes a lot more efficient over time. So those would be the 3 things I would say.
Yeah, it's very, with application security, a lot of things are just alerts, and correlating them to real risk, right? That's the value that you're talking about, and being mindful. Just because it shows up as a critical CVSS doesn't mean that it actually correlates to real risk based on where the application's sitting.
That's correct. Yeah, where the application is sitting, like for example, is that code actually called, right? And so this is sort of the challenge between, you look at predictive sort of indicators versus actual risk indicators, right? So if you say, hey, look, here's a piece of code that's vulnerable, but it's not called. Okay, is that really a risk? I would say no. If it's deeper in within your organization and it's not related to critical data, is that as much of a risk? So the CVSS v4 has that coming out in the latest standard, right? So that's how we're going to, as an industry, adopt those sort of mechanisms. So I'm excited about that. It's going to require enriching data at scales that we haven't had to do with CVEs at this point. So that's going to be exciting. So yeah, I mean, I think understanding the risk for those things is hard, because a lot of that has to do with, well, how likely, how difficult is this to pull off this kind of attack, and how likely is it? And the likelihood is very hard to actually model.
So
You said one thing, said a lot of great things. One of the things that jumped out at me was understand risk from the business perspective.
Yes.
Right? Ultimately, that kind of is what matters.
Yes.
Because it's
Value
the
chain. Yep.
risk tolerance, the impact, what. So
Yes.
it really isn't your risk tolerance. You might have your own, yes. But in what
It's
context?
not security's risk tolerance, it's the businesses.
Yeah, exactly. There's a really good question. Maybe Sam, you want to kind of chime in on it, and of course Chris too. What's the difference between like basically DevSecOps and supply chain security in applications? Is one more focused on risk and compliance regulations, or I think it's good to kind of tease that apart a little bit. Are they overlapping, intersecting when we talk about one? Is it not the other? Sam, any initial thoughts on that?
I actually like Chris to start on this one.
Okay.
Throw it back
so
to Chris.
I look at the supply chain as an element of sort of DevSecOps, right? And AppSec plugs into that. That's how I look at it. So you have capabilities, and then you have sort of organization design philosophies, right? So I look at supply chain security as a capability that you have to have. The question is then, how do you then take that and integrate that into the organization through process and organizational structure? And that's where DevSecOps really comes into place, in my mind.
I was also trying to buy a little bit of time for participant 79 to give me some more context. So it looks like what they're really wondering about is, when you have a supply chain based application, so like the tooling in your supply chain, what kind of security should be taken on that versus normal application security. Hopefully I'm getting that right. Give me a thumbs up if I did, participant 79. But like, how do you secure your DevOps tools versus how do you secure your actual applications?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's very different than what I thought it initially was.
Oh, that's a tough one. Yeah. So the challenge is you get into pipelines and configurations and identity strategies, right? Really, really quickly. And that is an area developers tend not to be a strength of developers. And the trick in a lot of those situations is, how do you manage things at the right level? You have to solve the right problem. If you solve the wrong problem well, it's not going to get you the outcome that you want. I think you have to solve the right level of abstraction. So we manage things at the team level. What teams have access to what? We don't manage at the individual level. That's just an example. And is that perfect? No, but it's a whole lot easier, right? It scales a whole lot better. So teams being around the size of 20 to 50 people, right? Kind of thing, right? You can over tighten that bolt really easily. So those are some of the things that I would look at, but a lot of it, when you get into ADO and things like that, and yes, there are sorts of things like secrets management and stuff like that, but the IAM tends to be the hardest thing because developers tend not to like to have those kind of things. So you got to really think through it and make sure you have a scalable solution. But secrets management, all that kind of stuff, very important. But developers tend to get that kind of stuff. I feel like it's the more traditional sort of softer side type stuff in the security space that developers tend to have a harder time with.
Yeah. Like least privilege access as well, right? I can't tell you how many times I've seen someone, let's go create a token, all admin privileges, no expiration date.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I'll forget the token in a little bit. Yeah.
Yep. Happens all the time.
For sure.
Well, and there's so many stats around, configuration errors, that kind of thing, is being in the top, 5 or 30, whatever, of what leads to being compromised. And of course, one of those is secrets embedded in, the repository and code. And it's not hard. It's a little bit of work to set it up, if you're going to use some kind of a vault or something to do that. But once you do it, it's pretty darn easy.
But you got to set it up so that it is easy to use.
Yes.
Right. If your answer is, well, we're not going to do anything and all the developers just need to figure it out.
Like the way we did it on our last, what we currently do is we set up, here's a Python code included in your project. It sets everything up for you. You just call it this way. So you don't have to worry about authenticating and how to do that. And where the key is to get started. And
that's right. Abstract all that stuff away, compartmentalize it, give it to them as a library, as a module, as a sidecar. All those are very, very, those are the architectural patterns you want to use. Make it easy for them to do the right thing. Right? So that's sort of we talked a little bit about the art of this kind of stuff, and that's sort of like, understanding and empathy and stuff. Like, make it easy for people to do the right thing. It is, a lot of times it is that simple.
Well, that's the frictionless, as much as, developers like salespeople, they'll go to the path of least resistance.
And you can't blame them because they're under pressure, just like sales.
You put up a roadblock, now it's a challenge, right?
That's right. That's right.
To show you I can mow down your roadblock.
Flow just like water, right?
Exactly. I'd love to hear your perspective on your in collaboration interfacing with security people, right? Because I used to think 5 years ago, I thought, oh, security people should at least learn something about like software architecture, or just
I think
kind
they
of how
should.
this stuff's
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
And for some people that might make sense, but that was a fool's errand recommending that. I mean, I'm not trying to turn security people into software, but you got to
Yeah.
do more than just make them cohabitate on working
That's right.
together,
You do.
right?
Especially in a DevOps environment. So this gets back to, so there's a couple things, right? Part of it is making sure you set people up for long-term success in their career. And if you care about them, you'll do that. And as a leader, that can be hard sometimes because you have to put pressure on them to grow. It's not comfortable to do for anybody. Don't kid yourself. And so you've got to grow people to get them ready for what they need now and for what they're going to need for the rest of their career. And that's caring about people. I mean, fundamentally, do you care about the people? And so part of that is, yes, I think everybody in security needs to have a strong foundation in networking, in a little bit of Linux or Windows. And I mean, like, as in can read, MSDN, not TechNet, right? And they need to have enough in software development. I think the sort of a reasonable minimum is Python, although, and Krebs wrote an article on this a couple of years ago, and I agree with him. And I've been saying this like, if you learn C, everything else is easier, like 10 times easier later in life. And I know I'm old and crusty and, get off my lawn and go use a C compiler, right? All jokes aside, C is a beautiful language and almost everything else is built in C. And then once you understand that and memory management, not that you're going to be a professional developer, just like I'm not a professional writer. Nobody's ever confused me with that. But I can write, like prose in English, right? But I'm not a professional writer. Just similarly, I think people should learn enough development in order to be able to understand how they plug in. Doesn't mean I'm a professional programmer, but they should learn enough. So I think a reasonable minimum standard is Python in that area.
I agree with that. I think telling people to learn C, respectfully to you, Chris, is that's a lift. That's a bit, if for people who would get into, programming and understanding it and kind of get a little jazzed about it, maybe, but yeah,
it's
I think you'll turn them off more. If you
I think it's one of those things where the sooner you do it in your career, the higher the ROI, right? So it's always an ROI discussion. How much ever it take? What is the return on investment? The sooner you do it in your career, the better, the longer term the outlook. The higher the ROI. So if you're a mid-career or late career like myself, I wouldn't worry about it. But now I'm not sure I would do assembler, even though I've had to do that a few times.
I had to do that in college. Hey, I used to write.
Yeah, we've all done it. I mean, I think it's helpful to understand registries and all that kind of stuff. I do think that there's value. The question is there enough value, and does that really feed into learning other things later easier, right? And learning C does help you learn other things later easier. The question is how much easier and what's the ROI on that based on where you are in your career. But Python, I think, is a very good sort of middle ground for that.
It is the utility belt. It's what are those Brinkman the pliers that?
It's what Perl tried to be.
yeah, it's what Perl. Perl got a little New Jersey along the way. It became a little bit of everything, right?
Yes, Swiss Army chainsaw, right?
I'm going to agree with Python on this one for sure. Yeah, like if you look at universities, they force C++, and you see a lot of people go, you know what? Maybe I don't want to be a developer. Unfortunately.
Yeah. So I think having that foundation, right, and establishing that foundation so that you have security people who understand enough about development, enough about networking, enough about Linux. Like if you can do Linux from scratch, that is a very good bar, right? There's a high bar, but like in terms of like, if you go any higher, any deeper than that, you've probably gone too far. Is that a reasonable minimum standard? No, absolutely not. That's too much, right? But the high watermark is there. The low watermark is something around like the LPI 101, 102, 201 type of level course. You understand how the boot sequence works, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, establish a minimum standard, right? And make sure everybody is trained to that minimum standard. And in security space, as well as the DevOps space, frankly, right? The DevSecOps space. And I think you'll get a lot of efficiencies in the long run.
I'm kind of going back to the original question about, learning from what you've learned and how would you start out? If someone's, more at a 300 level course, intermediate level, of where they are in their AppSec program to move themselves, to the 500 level course,
Sure.
maybe masters or beyond level. To use that analogy, what are some of the challenges or things to do that you really need to take on to step it up and take it another level?
So I think there's two things, right? One is aligning to the details, which has to do, I think, to some degree with what Sam was saying in terms of like, here's the threat. How would the threat actor execute on this, and then how much of a risk is it really, right? And I think really understanding like it at the MITRE ATT&CK framework level, like at the pen tester level, and then being able to plan with those skills. Right? It's not the pen testing skills, it's the wisdom you gain from it by then being able to turn around and plan from an operations perspective and how in the DevSecOps space, is this a problem or not? Right. So I have a vulnerability. Do we process, libwebp? Do we process WebP images? Blah, 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 blah. Right. Like and then how you orchestrate that as a planning apparatus. That to me is sort of a 500 level capability because you have to know enough about pen testing or hardcore incident response to be able to develop those planning apparatus, the planning capabilities to feed into that and really tie in DevSecOps. It's hard. It's very, very hard. The other one is risk, like we talked about before, right? Exception management at scale is very, very, very difficult, right? So you talk about your risk. You brought up the risk threshold, and I'm glad you brought that up because I'll sort of tack on that for a minute. So if I'm an application and I have an exception and say, listen, this is not an issue, or there's a difference between a false positive versus I accept the risk on this, right? If you say I accept the risk on this, it's a problem, but I accept the risk. Should that modulate your score? Or in other words, like, hey, do I get a risk exception and that changes my score because it was a 55, but now that a risk exception is a 57? I don't think so. I think that modulates your risk threshold, right? And so how you tie those things in together at scale across many different risk acceptance processes, at SAST, SCA, container scanning, blah, 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 blah. That's 500 level stuff. We're working towards that right now. It's super hard. Super, super hard.
So one of the things that I would say people don't do before they get to that 500 level, they start adding security gating, right? They start saying, hey, whatever this scanner is, you just mentioned like 3, container scanning, SAST, SCA, they add those in and they immediately go to, let's start blocking developers based on these security gates. And they haven't come up with a way to manage the risk exception yet. And that is a surefire way to shoot yourself in the foot.
You're
rolling out an AppSec program.
No empathy for developers, right? No empathy for developers. Are trying to build. Again, that gets back to the value chain. Where do you sit on the value chain? And what do you need to do to help increase the value on the value chain, right? And we're helping preserve that value on the value chain. And you have to understand that in your business. And if you think you're going to go in with a big hammer and start swinging around, you're going to create a mess.
Well,
might not last there.
To me, an analogy that I think of is if you think of Formula One or Indy or NASCAR kind of racing, pulling people off the track is a big deal, right?
Yes.
It's one thing to come in, everybody's got a pit and timing of all that and all that kind of stuff. Pull off the track and say, we need you to come over here and stop for a while we do something. It better be extreme. It has to be required. But while things are happening on the track, right, there's all kinds of telemetry, decisions, communication, analysis. And that's how we kind of have to think about security. It's in the flow of how work happens, how software is created, how infrastructure is code or what infrastructure is set up, whatever it might be. Sbombs are being produced, analysis, software composition analysis, all those things create telemetry for us. We just have to figure out the right way to harness it so we know what's going on. We know how things are performing. We know when there's issues starting to develop, and we know when to take action when we can preventatively or when something does happen. That's the analogy that works in my mind.
So the trouble with that, I think, is at the really senior levels, if I'm going to be honest. I think, and I don't mean this, I think this is sort of an audit level problem and a board governance level problem, right?
Okay.
It is not, and I don't mean senior engineers or product developers. The challenge I think that we have broadly in industry is a problem of accountability and responsibility. Okay. The question is, what does it mean to be a control owner versus a control operator? Who actually has the risk? these are sort of fundamental questions I don't think are well answered, and I think that's really, really inconsistent in industry right now.
And it's shifting too, because security has thought of themselves as we're protecting ourselves from ourselves, right? Maybe still does.
In some cases,
some
yes.
organizations, I think that's changed a lot, right? And more of a
people have to
risk
let
profile.
go, right? And so the challenge is that the art of it becomes, how do you set up a framework so that people understand their risk, and they are managing their risk as opposed to managing the risk for them, right? And that takes a different view of the problem, and that's very hard to do in AppSec without having development experience. It's not impossible, but it's very hard to do. And so, if you're able to structure that in a way that says, okay, listen, we're going to help you understand your risk and we're going to provide you information. But then, the risk is, if you want to go live with this kind of a vulnerability, I mean, hey, I don't know that I would, because we don't have, back to the planning apparatus. Here's the vulnerability. We do not have WAF, or we do have WAF protections that could prevent it. Here's the attack chain, blah, 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 blah. So you draw out that element there and say, look, how would an adversary exploit that? And then how do you come up with that quickly at scale is very, 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 very hard.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you drive that to execution? So yeah. It's very difficult.
Cody appeared. That's a good thing when that happens. Hey, Cody, how you doing, man?
Do we have time for this last question before Cody takes over? Or are we
Cody's going to do this first, and then when we take that last question,
Cool.
If that's okay, Sam.
Sure. So I'm just here to give away a couple of gift cards, and then I'll return for the closing notes at the end. So the 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Irina J, Tyson K, Josh S, and Liraz E. So look for an email coming from me later today. If you don't happen to see an email, check your spam folder just in case it happens to get filtered out. All right, Sam, I'll throw it on right back to you.
Great.
No worries. I thought you were closing it up. So this last question, how have recent events highlighted the importance of supply chain security? I'll take this one first. Just from what I see, so many more malicious packages are being published into NPM, for example. That's something we specifically do. Just the amount that you see is so much greater than it used to be. Now, is that because we're just focusing more on detection now, or is it because this is what people are actually trying to do with an attack vector? Chicken or the egg?
I think it's more common, but for sure, a lot of it is we're seeing more of it because we're looking at more of it. So I think the answer is sort of both, and that's hard, right? Because it doesn't give you a clean, easy answer on what to do next. It's a challenge, and the bigger challenge though is how do you set up the processes so that you don't become the boy who cries wolf, right? And that is also very challenging. There are a lot of exciting things like Google's managed packages, those kind of things. I think they call it curated open source. Those kind of things are exciting because the reality is that most companies are if you're trying to develop at scale, you're trying to get product out, you're not reasonably going to be able to have an allow list of software open source packages. I don't think that is a workable model. I think you have to go into detection space. I think you have to move quicker. I think that puts more challenges on the security space, but I think from a value perspective for the business, that's the right answer.
I think to your point, Chris, it's the sources you get them from, right?
Oh,
and what are they doing, whether it's repositories or GitHub or whatever it might be. I just want to pull anything randomly out of the air if possible. I'd rather go to trusted sources first, right?
Yep. Well, that's the problem. I've seen some, and this really just gets under my skin. I'm seeing some open source teams or some companies that are what's the word? Sort of funding open source projects. They're moving their repositories or packages completely out of GitHub or the common repositories and moving them into their own private spaces. And that is just, that's a recipe for disaster. I would highly encourage teams to not use those kind of capabilities. If you have a package that's been moved off of a common, moved off NPM, moved off PyPy, whatever, consider it abandoned unless you're willing to set up your own pipeline to pull from source and then own that as a responsibility. And when I say you, I mean the dev team who wants that package, which I don't think they're going to want to do. Consider the package. The software might not be abandoned, but the package is.
Yeah, it's like responsible open source usage versus like creating this crazy allow list. I think in my opinion, the idea of the allow list died like 9-10 years ago. When you
Thankfully,
started to
yes.
try and do it at scale, like it's just not possible.
It's not. It's not.
It's another one of those barriers the developers is that I see your allow list and watch me break through it.
I'll raise you one more, right?
I'll raise you more.
For sure.
Well, we're kind of coming up close to the end of our time. I want to give folks a chance to get onto their next Zoom meeting or whatever they're doing from our conversation. So maybe Chris, if you want to kind of give a parting thought summary from, anything from our conversations or something you didn't get to say.
Plan ahead.
Sam,
ahead.
If you would jump into. Sorry, I stepped on what you're saying.
Sorry, I would just say plan ahead. Make sure you have a plan. Make sure it encompasses. Make sure you understand where you are in the value chain, and make sure that you develop solutions that are highly scalable, that fit the capabilities of your team, and don't break dev. Don't break dev.
Break the build, don't break dev. Huh?
I mean, you can break the build if you have to, right? Like there's critical vulnerabilities or whatever, but by gosh, you better make sure you have exception processes. Don't break the build. Don't break the dev process.
Interesting. Okay, Sam.
So kind of going along with scalable automated solutions, one of the easiest things you can do is keep your dependencies up to date. So whether you're using GitHub's DependABot or using our free tool, Mend Renovate, right? There's a handout available for you. It's free. Use it. Just keep your dependencies up to date. And obviously, depending on whatever you're using, will help you not upgrade into malicious packages as well. That is the number one thing you can do, right? It's like doing maintenance on your house. You don't wait till things start falling apart, do the preventative maintenance.
All right. Well, I'm gonna. I don't work for Mend, but I appreciate that you are sponsoring this conversation very much. So I would ask everyone to go check out Mend.io. It's where you can get the software that Sam's talking about, and of course a lot of other things. And just show your appreciation by coming a little bit more informed of what Mend might do for you. So we've got a lot of great things there, like a lot of great people like Sam on their team. So we enjoy working with them here. So. All right, Cody, I'm going to let you do the wrap up, but Sam, Chris, it's been a lot of fun. Really enjoyed doing this with you.
Likewise.
Great. Back to you in the booth, Cody.
Thank you, Mitch, and Sam, Chris. Thank you both so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure meeting you before we took this live. I would like to remind our audience that our session today was recorded. So following this, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find this recording living on the Security Boulevard website. So just visit securityboulevard.com/webinars, and you will find it in the on-demand section. I'd like to thank Mend for sponsoring our program. I'd like to once again thank Sam, Chris, and Mitch for being here with us. And to our audience, if you are still hearing my voice, thank you so much for sticking it out with us today. We do have a link to the survey pinned to the top of the chat, and we do have those handouts there for you as well. So feel free to grab those before we close things out. But we do appreciate everyone joining here at Tech Strong Learning. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.